All right. Good morning, everybody, and thanks for joining us. Welcome to New America. My name is Ross Schulman. I'm co-director of New America's Cybersecurity Initiative, along with Ian Wallace, who is back there waving his hand, saying hi. The Cybersecurity Initiative is a joint project between New America's International Security Project and the Open Technology Institute, also here at New America, of which I am the representative co-director. Ian's with the ISP. And we're focused on a broad range, a wealth of interesting topics, including vulnerabilities management, state and local governance, and many more. This morning, we've got a very interesting panel for you. Many of you probably know, but some of you perhaps don't know about CIS, but they have created, through a collaborative process with a lot of the very important folks in the security industry, a set of best practices for how to set up cyber defenses if you're a small company, all the way up to a large enterprise. And it's a really interesting document. I urge you guys to read it if you haven't, and we're going to get some more information on it here in just a sec. But along with those controls, recently CIS has started branching out into discussing the privacy implications of the security controls themselves. And that's what we're here to talk about today. How do these two topics work together? How do they dovetail? And when you're implementing security, what do you need to be thinking about in terms of privacy? With that said, folks, I know that there is plenty of folks watching online. If you want to tweet questions at us, please tweet to @NewAmCyber, which is our handle, and use the hashtag NewAmCIS if you want to chat about the goings on. And finally, before we get started, I wanted to plug, for those of you who are interested in the topic, this Friday we have another event put on by the Cybersecurity Initiative at 10 a.m. right here on public-private partnerships aside from information sharing, because I feel like that topic's kind of been done. So, without further ado, let me introduce our panel this morning. Directly to my left here is Rick Doughton, Chief Cyber and Information Security at the Crumpton Group. Did I pronounce that right? Great. To his left is Joan McNabb. Joan is Director of Privacy Education and Policy with the Office of the Attorney General in California for their Department of Justice. And finally, Tony Sager on the end. He's the Senior VP and Chief Evangelist for the for the Center for Internet Security. So I assume we'll be getting some evangelizing this morning. You got the message. Great. And so I want to start actually with you, Tony. Sort of as the evangelist for CIS. Fill us in a little bit. Presume that we don't know anything about CIS, about the controls, or about the privacy. And just give us a brief rundown of what exactly these are.
Sure, thanks, Russ. Yeah, very briefly. The Center for Internet Security is a nonprofit in cybersecurity, and the tagline we used to use is making best practice common practice. So let me tell you where that came from. I spent 35 years at the National Security Agency, all of it in cyber defense, or what we'd call cyber defense today, and ran the vulnerability finding part of defense. So things like penetration testing teams, people that find 0 days in software and that sort of thing. So I've had the luxury of studying this at very large scale, right? Seeing flaws that are found in the basic mathematics, in the software, in the individual products, up to and including the operational world. And so that's where terms like red teams and penetration testing teams come in. And I'll say, having watched that for decades, there were sort of two observations that led us to where we are today. One is that you see the same problem over and over and over again, right? We're not getting attacked by magic every day. What we're getting attacked by is millions of repeats of the same thing over and over again. So I was just seeing that happen at very large scale. And it wasn't that people were lazy or they didn't care. It was that this is a very operationally complicated problem, right? There's just 1,000 things to deal with, which leads to the second observation. Defenders, even though they have more tools, I grew up in the 70s in this, right? We didn't have any security tools to speak of. We really had no security market to draw upon. We had no notion of like threat feeds and the things that we have today. So we had really very little. We have mountains of that stuff today. And the problem today is we're overwhelmed by it. So we go from sort of this very narrow focus, the government cares, to this wide open marketplace, which comes with lots of great power, but also lots of noise. So this, same problems over and over again, and people are just overwhelmed. And so to help with that problem of drowning, and the term I used was the fog of more tools, more technology, more training than ever, but we're getting worse. And gathered a small group of friends, said no one leaves the room till we all agree on a small number of things that all of our friends should do, right? And the temptation in security, if you hire, if you want 10 security opinions, hire 5 consultants, right? There's just so much noise and so many opinions, and every one of us wants to solve world hunger. Oh, here's a list of 100 things to do, and if you get to that, I'll give you 500 more. And so the idea is keep it simple. Don't try to solve everything, but get started. Help people with that really the foundation, basic steps, things that we know have value against real attacks, not postulated attacks, not the million things that might happen, but things that really do happen. So that simple idea was a 2-page letter. I never dreamed it would become what it has become. The idea got picked up by the SANS Institute, which is the big teacher of this practice in this business. They turned it from 5 friends into 5,000 friends on a mailing list. Eventually, I retired in 2012, took the project back over, and spun it into a nonprofit company. Because I thought the idea was important enough that it really needed to be independent of anyone's business model. You needed a neutral, a market-neutral place. So that's what brought me to CIS, the Center for Internet Security. We're also the world's largest producer of independent producer of security benchmarks. So the controls are kind of at the level of operational practice, right? What technology should you have? How do you run it? What kind of procedure should you have in place? Benchmarks are at the lower level. How do I configure a Windows desktop, or a mail server or a web server? So very detailed, beyond the ability of most people to do on their own. So, but the model has been the same, is basically committed volunteerism. So we gather people together. The nonprofit is small but mighty, and so we are really kind of an organizing principle, right? A community organizer that brings all these folks together. So we have adopters around the world and lots of success. And then starting a couple years ago, we introduced a major new version 6, October 2015, and it was time to make a stand on privacy. We felt very comfortable with the IT security part of what we were doing. I think it stood up very well in the marketplace, lots of adopters, a lot of support from industry. But as we know, everything you do in IT, right, is reflected somehow in the management of data, collection, storage, everything you do about the permission that people have to do things on the enterprise, to look at information and so forth. There's a reflection of that in the IT, right? If you don't do that well, you can never get the privacy problem dealt with. So it was time for us to put some ideas out on the table, to gather experts. And the beauty of the CIS model is that there's one of the great virtues of our industry is it's full of really amazing people who are willing to give up their time if we could just find the common cause to rally them around, so including the folks here on the panel. So the idea was for us to take a stand, help people with this problem beyond the IT part of it, and then look at the implications of the data and the controls and the things and how we're going to address them in privacy. So I won't go on because I know you want to talk more about that in other dimensions, but that's the kind of rough story, right? We're really about helping people understand the problem that they need to solve, translate that into action, which is what the controls are. And then the phrase I use, it's not about the list, right? If you want a good list of things to do, you can go to lots of places. Really, CIS is about creating a community around the idea so that people can achieve what's on the list. How do we help each other? How do we learn from each other? How do we organize ourselves relative to the marketplace? How do we look at the topics that are associated with or reflected in the technology? So that's really the story behind the privacy part too.
Great, thank you Tony for that intro. Helps set the stage really well. Rick, you talked a lot about sort of volunteerism. I hear you're one of the experts that offered your time. So talk about it a little bit from the volunteer's perspective. How does the process work, and why were you interested in sort of chipping in on, well, CIS broadly, but also the privacy implications in particular?
Well, CIS broadly, I was near the beginning when it, maybe years ago, I kind of got involved because I knew a lot of the same people. It's a small community, particularly here in DC, and we were talking about it was the consensus audit guidelines back then. And so, we started contributing to that. The privacy element was one that I found that when I was part of one of the reviews of one of the versions, I said, you know, privacy is only mentioned once in this. And I said, but on the plus side, the ISO 27002 was only mentioned twice. So you're not doing too bad there. And so we talked with Jane Lute, who at the time was president, about we need to do something in privacy. And as Tony had mentioned, that was where the privacy impact assessment kind of guide came out first with version 6, and we had all worked on that. And then knowing that we wanted a more thorough privacy addendum to talk about how these controls apply to privacy, because one of the things that was very dear to me is understanding the difference between privacy and security. I've been a security guy my entire career, and about 10 years ago I had a customer who had a privacy issue, and I said, oh yeah, that's confidentiality, I got that. And I'm like, no, this is privacy. And I was like, no, we got it. I mean, we're professional hackers, we've done risk assessments, we know all this stuff really well, it's fine. And at the end I kind of got argued down of like, I'm wrong. It's not just encrypting things and putting it over here, it's the appropriate use of data based on regulation or the consent of the person who gave it to you. I mean, that's very different of how you kind of manage this data. And one of the things, keeping that in mind over the years, and when I became a CISO myself, gone through the safe harbor process back when that was a thing, and understanding all the things as a defender that were privacy, we really found that there was a big gap in what IT people understood about privacy, and they're holding on to privacy data that they need to control, and they don't realize it. And so that's really the thing that kind of got me into, kind of pushing this and getting to wanting to build this, work with the group to produce this document.
Great, thanks. And then, Joan, let's turn to you, because you're a bit of the outsider on the panel. You work for the AG's office in California. Tell us a little bit about why you're here.
Yeah, so I'm not a security expert by any means, nor am I an attorney, so you need to know that, because I have lots of opinions, which I'm perfectly willing to share. They are not legal opinions. They are my opinions. One of the things we do in the California Attorney General's office, in the privacy unit where I work, is we get reports of data breaches. By our breach law, entities are required to report to the Attorney General whenever they have a breach affecting more than 500 Californians. So, and I and my staff are the ones who get these reports and who look at them before we decide what all we might do. And when we get them, we look at them all. Some of them we look at very closely. Sometimes we take an enforcement action in relation to a breach. But most of the time, we don't take an enforcement action. A breach is an opening, and it opens up practices. And so we can look in and then ask more questions to find out what are the practices regarding data that might be problematic. And when we see things and see that there are lessons to be learned, we write them up and publish them. So nearly every year we publish a breach report showing what we saw in breaches reported to us that year and what recommendations we have. So in 2016, we were looking at 4 years of data breaches, and what we saw is similar to what Tony remarked about what he saw in defending at NSA, is that while there are a variety of types of breaches, that they had many elements in common, many in that the vast majority of them were enabled or facilitated by known vulnerabilities for which there are known controls. And we saw kind of the same things that Tony was talking about, that yes, the metaphor I use is if you're protecting your house, maybe somebody could be coming overhead in a helicopter and drop a spider robot down your chimney that would automatically find the hidden jewels and crack the safe and take them out. More likely, there are far more people who are coming in through the unlocked doors, the open windows, the fact that you don't have a burglar alarm and that you're not fenced. So if you can get the burglar alarm, put up the fence, lock the doors, close the windows, you're going to defend against most of the attacks. Either you'll stop it, you'll slow it, it'll mitigate it, you'll discover it faster, and it won't be as devastating. So we wanted to, in our recommendation in that year's report, we wanted to move the ball forward by pointing to something more concrete than what cybersecurity law says. So essentially all of the cybersecurity laws are not real specific about what to do. HIPAA perhaps gets closest to being specific in some ways. What they say commonly is use reasonable and appropriate security to protect the information. And so we wanted to put some flesh on the bones of the legal concept of reasonableness. And so we started looking at security standards. And we looked at the NIST cybersecurity framework. We looked at ISO 27002. We looked at a number of standards and found, that they had many things in common, and they were hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of pages long. And certainly I didn't know the fog of war term, but there was certainly more. And then we came upon what I had previously known as the SANS Top 20, the CIS Critical Security Controls. 20 things that are the top priority things to do that will give you the most bang for your buck against the most common kinds of cyber attacks. And we spent some time reviewing these. I didn't know anybody at CIS and decided, okay, this is going to be what we're going to point to. So in that report, we made a recommendation that the security controls, as relevant to one's environment, would constitute a floor of reasonable security, that the failure to implement the relevant controls would be an indication of unreasonable security. What reasonableness might be achieved by the controls or not, but we wanted to, this is the bottom line. And that's how I got involved with CIS and with the controls.
Who is California is a diverse state, obviously, and you have Google, who probably has, better security than the CIS baseline, I would imagine, and all the way down to, a corner store somewhere. Is there a target that you guys are aimed at?
Well, we're aiming at everybody who holds other people's information, because they have legal and ethical obligations to protect it by law. But in our outreach efforts, we've particularly focused on small businesses, because they don't have the technological and other sorts of resources to get a good grip on security, and yet very small businesses can have a whole lot of very sensitive data. Think of medical practices, legal practices, and we saw in our data, in our breach information, that they are being targeted. In 2016, for example, 24% of the breaches reported to us were in small businesses by SBA definition, so it's specific to the industry sector. So they are being targeted, and we felt that they needed help.
Great. Let's dig in a little bit more on the privacy implications themselves. Tony, just walk us through how the privacy implications guide, it sort of marches in lockstep with the CIS controls themselves, and addresses each one individually. Sort of how do the privacy implications, how do they get an organization, be it a small mom and pop shop to something bigger, from zero to at least some privacy?
I think if you look at the history of say, security frameworks and the documents, some of the things that Joan plowed through to try and make sense of it, right? You have everything from what I'll call cosmic frameworks, very high level, all-encompassing, very comprehensive, but they're often
put somebody in charge.
Yeah, but they're often so high level that
Have a CIO.
yeah, and so they don't seem to change behavior much, right? They are nice for what they do, but they're a classic world hunger, and write me a report on how you save the world, and then of course you have to set up a massive bureaucracy of vetting, assessment, enforcement, reports that probably never get read, and that sort of thing, down to I'll call it highly specific, right? Very granular. And we've always kind of aimed for the middle. That is, the more sort of technically specific you make things, the less broadly applicable they are, right? And every enterprise is different in the sense of its kind of basic mission, the IT it has, the kind of people it has, the way the management thinks of the role of IT in the business. So there's no one size fits all. Yet there's got to be something better than cosmic, where everyone is just kind of. So we aim for this kind of middle ground here, and someone just told me the other day, one of the things we love about your work is it's very prescriptive. I said, I get about 5% of people say, we really can't stand your work because it's so prescriptive. And so we get that.
Or it's not prescriptive enough.
Exactly. So you have to, there's no one answer. You have to think about what level do you aim at. So in the technical controls, we aim towards being specific enough that people know what to do, yet they still have options on how to do it. When you look at privacy and sort of look at the content and the data, you can't be quite as prescriptive. You have to help people make decisions, right, good choices. And so everything you do in cyberspace has some kind of implication around privacy. The data you collect, who has access to it, how it's stored, how it's accessed, how it's combined. And so you have to help people make good choices. I mean, that's kind of one of our life philosophies at CIS, right? It's about helping people make an intelligent choice, number one, and then be able to explain to others how they made that choice, right? And these are really two distinct and really important problems. So helping people is a good thing, but at the end of the day, they're going to have to answer to a breach report, an auditor, an insurance company, the legal system. So they have to be able to explain at some level what they have done. So that's the reason we took that basic approach. In my background, I mentioned that in SA, we didn't call it privacy, but we had all these operational missions like the red team testing, blue team testing, the unfortunately named ComSec monitoring, where we would listen to friendly forces to see what are we giving away for free to the bad guys. Every one of those has the same implications that we're talking about today, right? Every one of them, NSA was doing that work because of some legal framework that defined we were authorized to do it and therefore allowed to collect certain data. We had to just build in technical controls, right, to minimize the opportunity for failure. We had to identify the kind of data and what's the minimum amount of data needed to achieve the purpose. Okay, can we make the rest of it anonymized or deleted, at the collection point and not put into the database?
You're basically building FIPS.
Yeah, and then the role of people, right? The people that are going to actually do analysis, right? Who is authorized? What process do you have to make sure that they have the right skills? What process do you have to recover from a mistake? How is it reported? How is it cleaned up afterwards? So we had built all that, as a framework for these operational type missions that we had at NSA. So I look around at what we were doing in the controls, I thought, we haven't done any of this. Great folks like Rick said, you need to think more about these kinds of problems. Jane Lute was the CEO of our nonprofit at the time. She had a major emphasis on that when she was at Homeland Security. So, really the way the privacy appendix got put into version 6, between Rick, I think, coming to talk to me, and Jane. And I said, Jane, yes, we will do something about privacy in the controls someday. Because I had already finished it, with version 6. It was ready to go. And she says, no, someday is now. We're going to do it now. And I think we grabbed Rick at some point. And
yeah, the PIA we did in like 2 weeks.
Yeah, so this, I said, if you could turn around 2 weeks, because we've already committed to a release date. And to the credit, I mean, great people jumped in. And this is the beauty of our model, right? This is, folks who had the background that we couldn't afford to hire, let's say, and the passion for this as a topic immediately came together, grabbed their friends who, some of the former privacy folks at DHS became part of the team. So just a pretty amazing collection of ideas got put together in a hurry. But just to kind of summarize, this was about how can we help people make sure that they thought about all the implications of this. We lined it up with the controls because, we often think, well, we'll worry about that privacy stuff later. We'll see what we have, and then we'll figure out how to control it and who should. No, if you don't design that in, it's almost impossible to get right at the tail end. And we wanted to tie it together at the control level so that we could make a choice and say, while you're thinking about this piece of technology to deal with this part of the cyber problem, you realize you're collecting this kind of data. What are the implications of it? Who should have access to it? Are you going to store it? How much of it do we actually need for downstream analysis? Let's make those choices right up front.
And that actually raises another interesting question that really I kind of want to put to all of you, but Joan, I'd love it if you could sort of address it first, and that is, in reading through the privacy implications guide, you would be blind if you didn't notice that almost every recommendation says, first of all, get IT and legal together and get them to talk to each other. 2 questions, I think, Joan, from your perspective. First of all, I imagine that the specification in every single stage comes about because that's not happening as often as we'd like. And then secondly, why is that so crucial?
Well, I think that the reason for calling on legal to get involved all the time is that is generally in large companies where the privacy responsibility is situated. It's either in the legal counsel's office or it is part of legal in some way. So the idea is to bring the people responsible for privacy together with the people responsible for cybersecurity. And one of the things that appealed to me in working on this project of the privacy implications document is I think there are operational opportunities to improve both the security and the privacy by getting them to work together. There's a kind of different mindset in the two practitioners, I think. Security practitioners are technical, process-oriented. Privacy people are often not always as accustomed to thinking practically and procedurally. I mean, yes, they are. Yes, they do. You have to. You have to be more than somebody who knows the laws to be a privacy officer. You have to be able to work with people and understand the processes of your organization. And I think that they can learn from each other by working together. So there are opportunities to make both better, such as one of the first two controls are about knowing what you have, knowing what, and inventorying and gathering information on the hardware and the software that you are using in your organization. Well, that's an opportunity to do a data inventory, just right along while you're doing it. And doing a data inventory is a really difficult thing that privacy officers always need to do. You need to know where is the kind of information you're supposed to protect, what kind do you have, what does it connect to, trying to draw a data map, which they're all going to, multinational companies are going to have to master because the new European regulation that takes effect next May requires it. And that's I look forward to a continuing proliferation of tools to assist in that. But even in a more rudimentary way, when you're inventorying the hardware and software, that's a good time to start on the data inventory. So that's just an example of how they can improve each other, privacy
Great.
and security.
Yeah. Rick, if you have anything to add to that question, I'd love to hear that too, but I also want to throw another one your way, which is, I think, a little bit related, perhaps, and that is, you're a practitioner. You've done this in the field, unlike the rest of us who just opine about it. Well, okay, that's not true, but it's true for me. And so, what are the challenges? What's the downside of the privacy implications guide? What's the hardest thing to sort of do for your average company that's laid out in there?
Well, the biggest challenge is just inter-company communication.
Yeah.
Technology is always the easy
That's
part.
why I asked these now, because I figured
Right.
that was the answer.
And so yes, and that's why we really foot stomp the act that we need to get these two groups together. Because in each of those, if you read through it, there is examples even in the inventory that's like, all right, well, executives have this type of phone or this type of device. Well, if I know that and that's leaked, then everyone knows if you have this device and therefore you're executive. Or in monitoring, it's like, and particularly like with mobile devices, if I'm monitoring mobile devices, I know where people are. Do I need to know where they are in the world at any given time? Have I produced a, do the chief privacy officer know that there's a capability that everyone is being tracked all the time, and is that in the privacy statement for the employees? So those are just kind of things that we're kind of bringing up as questions that neither side has the answer to, because I always say that cybersecurity folks and lawyers, and Joan is not a lawyer, as she makes very clear, but she plays with them all the time. We don't make the final decisions. We provide counsel, and so therefore the challenge, the biggest challenge is like, yes, okay, this is what we need to do. Well, this group has never talked to this group before. Mm-hmm. No one likes working with lawyers. I love working with lawyers, by the way, to all the lawyers out there. And so
have I told you guys that I'm a lawyer, by the way?
Oh, there you go. See, we knew we liked you.
There you go.
So getting them together and saying, all right, well, do you realize that this full packet capture reviewing we have in place collects everything, including stuff that is privacy protected and case data for litigation hold and private PHI for people who are emailing their doctors, and no one knew that that was there sitting on this server? Well, we need to understand how to protect that and manage that data.
An interesting question, and that is, as you guys were putting this together, how do you solve what must be a really inherent conflict between a security engineer's desire to log literally everything for later and the clear privacy problems that presents?
Well, and then that's where they need to get together. It's like, well, Chief Privacy Officer, what would satisfy you? It's like, okay, well, that it is isolated, that we have access control, that we know who gets it, we have reports on who gets it, we have whenever it's looked at, and that there's a process by which maybe we, almost like a warrant, allow someone to go access it.
And is there a defined retention period?
Yeah,
right.
Exactly, retention period, things forever. Like that. So because if you just say, and that's where the challenge comes in, is if they find out, oh, we have this data, no, we can't store it. Well, there's a business reason for storing it from an IT risk management perspective, from a forensic standpoint, and there is a regulatory requirement or a company policy against having it. So how can we come together and resolve it? Because all of these can be resolved with policy or just privacy statements or things that employees sign off that I acknowledge I have no expectation of privacy and that they know where I am at a given time. They will not tell my spouse or will not be used in any case unless it's in my consent. It's like there are ways around it, but if you ask each of them individually, they will say, no, you can't do that, or yes, we have to do that.
And this problem of the conversation was, you're exactly right. Right, we'd do anything to avoid making a hard decision up front, and this discussion about the implications is a hard decision. And sort of thinking it through, and you're exactly right. The technologists think, well, we can collect it, so we'll collect it, because we might need it someday. It'll make our mining algorithms really clever if we have all this, as compared to thinking about what purpose do we need to achieve with this? What's the minimum set of data it takes to achieve that, and then who should be authorized to deal with that data? What processes, what people, and so forth. And those are hard to tease out, right? And we'd all rather get to the more interesting problem of installing stuff and running stuff. But if you don't do those things up front, you'll create unsolvable problems. I mean, this is the story of many of the, what I call national level threat sharing things that I've been involved with for a long time. Well, we'll just share across the public and private sectors, and everyone knows stuff about cyber incidents, and we'll all share it, and then we'll all be really smart, right? Well, we never get past the initial stage because you get mired in this decision about the data, how it was collected, and we always try to solve the worst case first. Store everything. Right? Then the lawyers go, no. So now you're in a 3-year discussion that leads nowhere.
And that's exactly the thing, is that the IT doesn't want to tell the attorneys because they think they're going to have this argument that they don't feel like they have a defense against. And so that's another reason why we want to kind of empower both sides to say, okay, let's come to agreement.
Joan, you mentioned that small and medium businesses are sort of a big portion of the problem here. Those sorts of companies oftentimes don't have a privacy officer or even a lawyer of any kind, except maybe an HR person or a corporate formation person.
Until they have a breach.
Right, until they have a breach, yes, and then they've got lots of lawyers. But what advice can we give to really small organizations that just can't get a lawyer?
Well, in the outreach we've been doing, we've had sort of 2 basic messages. One is you are a target too. Having seen that they feel like, well, nobody's going to come after me. I'm just over here in nowhere, and I'm this small little thing, and yet you've got all this data, and you are visible on the internet, and you are probably have many doors and windows open compared to some of your bigger colleagues. So, but we want to go beyond be afraid, be very afraid, to there are things you can do that can significantly reduce your risk and reduce the seriousness if you do get attacked. And so one thing we found really great about working with CIS is they have recently developed some new materials that are targeted to small and medium-sized enterprises to give them a sort of implementation guide to make the controls, which are very well explained in a document that's only like 90 pages or so, compared to the framework. The NIST framework is 300, I think. And even smaller and focused on the first, I think 5 or 6 controls, a smaller document that organizes in a way that makes sense and lays it out for them. Other materials that are going to be developed, that are in process of being developed, go on to a next step to help small business owners work with consultants, because that's the way it's done. You know, they're not doing the things themselves. They're hiring somebody, and they are often enough hiring somebody who's an IT person, not a security person, whose mission is to get the data flowing and keep you from calling for help. So leave everything default and open, because that's going to generate the fewer calls to the help desk, but that's not necessarily the most secure way to do it. So we're glad that CIS is going to be working toward helping the business owners question potential consultants, and then help the consultants who are not security experts see what some of the basic things are that they can do.
And even if they're security consultants, they don't understand privacy because they've never had to deal with it on both sides. And then the other element of the small medium businesses, oftentimes they are suppliers of goods or services to larger companies. Those larger companies, based on guidance of the industry, are applying more requirements for small medium business for security and privacy and transparency in that.
In a supply chain kind of.
Yeah, exactly, in a supply chain thing, because as well as they are a target themselves, just because they have access to infrastructure that can be used to make them money for various reasons, in various ways, they are also a conduit to a larger target that is a supplier. You know, yeah, exactly. Target as an example.
Great. Rick, walk us through a little bit. So, you're one of those outside consultants, essentially. If a company, small or large, whatever, comes to you and says, hey, we just read about the news today or yesterday, as it were, and you know what, I'm starting to get scared. Can you help me? What do you do when you sit them down? Like, how does this actually progress?
Well, I start with talking about the business. What do you guys do? Do you make something? Do you create something? Do you share with people? Are you supplying something? Because what would be a bad event? If you have intellectual property stolen, if you don't have access to your data, if other people don't have access to your data, if something blows up, these are all bad things. Okay, now what systems support that process that you don't want to go wrong, as we just described? And so it really kind of backs down from, because IT risk management is not about protecting IT, it's about protecting the business. And then as we work down, then and that's where the controls come in handy. It's like, do you know what you have on your network? Access and configuration management's 1, 2, and 3, because I can't protect it. The analogy I use is, if I'm a sheep herder, I cannot do my job if I don't know how many animals are in the field, which ones belong to me, and which one are sheep. So if I don't know that, how can I do my job? And that's where HIPAA, just like GDPR is going to have, is knowing what data, what systems are holding this data and what the data is and where it is the first step. So, so starting with that. If you don't have that, don't try to go buy cool new technology that, that protects against this thing. Because a lot of the things, this most recent incident that's hitting the world, or the second wave of it, is still a failure in just basic hygiene. If you were doing what you need to do anyway, it's not like this was exceptional circumstance. So start with the basics. And so that's how we do it, is let's understand the business, what's important, what systems support this aspect of the business, what data is important to you, who do you share it with, and sometimes there might be privacy implications to that they are not aware of. It's like you're collecting customer data, because unfortunately, organizations that don't have strong regulatory requirements seem to think that they can just punt on that. It's like, well, I have data. The only thing I have is data disclosure laws, of which there are 47 of them I need to worry about. And we do a lot with multinational companies or international companies, a lot in Canada, a lot in Mexico, a lot in Europe, and so they all have different kind of elements. And so understanding what is that floor, as you said, that you need to be meeting. But even if you have one of these regulations, that should be just the floor. You really should be building a security program, IT security risk management program, on how to protect the business. And therefore, these requirements, these regulations, these laws are just a reporting exercise of like, oh, okay, we meet that because we're doing this already, because we're doing what's important to protect the business from these bad things which I just identified, and then realize which systems support those.
Well, you just said the R word, which is everyone in DC's favorite term. So speaking of which,
What was the R word?
regulation.
Oh.
I was going to risk. Risk is
You
what
don't
this is
work
all
inside
about.
the
Risk
hallway.
management.
No, we don't care about risk in DC. We care
Risk
about regulation.
management. Right.
But Tony, you know, from your perspective as someone who is at CIS, you know, I don't know if you did you anticipate that these not just the controls themselves, but also the privacy implications guide part of it. Did you anticipate that a state would sort of grab these and say, you know what, this is a floor?
I knew someone would.
Yeah.
We were lucky to run into Joan. And I remember when we first saw the data breach report, and you know, our small team was looking at each other. Did you make this happen? Did you make this happen? Does anyone know how this happened? And so I think someone cold called California, right, the Attorney General's office. We tracked Joan down. And that was both, remember, we're running this with a really small company, right? We do not have some massive marketing department and some big outreach group. And so a lot of what has happened has been very organic. You know, we put it out there. And so I can't tell you, by the way, the amount of satisfaction we get when someone who's really bright, doing something really important, independently latches onto what we're doing. But the intent was to put it out there. And that's why I really pushed for this move it from the sponsorship of a very noble for-profit company, the SANS Institute, into a nonprofit home. Because in a for-profit setting, right, no matter the noble intent of SANS, governments can only interact with a for-profit in certain ways, right? And there's a certain formality and legal requirements to be met and so forth. And the basic idea was this really should be, you know, this is a classic community shared problem, shared solution space, right? If you have a problem in cyberspace, I guarantee you there's millions of others like you. You just can't find them, right? You have no mechanism to bring you together, share stories. How do I solve it? How do I convince my boss? How do I convince the regulator, et cetera? So the idea was to make it as open and accessible as possible with the least sort of friction and cost and so forth. So the fact that California jumped onto it, you know, was a really pleasant surprise, but it's not surprising in the sense of this is really what we wanted to have happen. Right. Then the question was, what do we do next? Right, so we talked to Joan. We found out, and she relayed the story of one of her biggest concerns was small to medium businesses doing business in California. And she'd reached a conclusion that we had reached. They are never going to be able to defend themselves. Right? It's just, you know, as a national security strategy, as a matter of social goodwill, thinking that that there's going to be suddenly an army of great security practitioners coming out of the schools and great tools, and they're going to hire these people with small, medium businesses it'll never happen. It just is not scalable. So the question is, what can we do then to help people who are never going to become experts, right? We don't ask every small, medium business to have doctors on staff and, you know, their own pilots for the private jets they don't own and so forth. So how do we scale this? You know, so the fact that someone got it says, then let's figure out how we can help Joan achieve what she wants. So I have a list of top 10 things to do, which actually has about 150 things to do. And things pop into the top 1 or 2 when someone great shows up at my doorstep who really cares, like a Rick or a Joan, right? So we decided we would speed up some work we were going to do to support small, medium businesses. So the first stage of that, Joan described, which is this, make the language more accessible. Security people are great at talking to other security people, right? We love the language, we love the acronyms, we can do this all day, and everyone else is on the sidelines going, what are these people talking about, you know? So we wanted to change the language of the controls, focus on the plainest English, focus on the kind of questions every small business should be able to answer, and then help them with what are the resources available to them at either low or no cost that would help them do that. And I was inspired by actually a paper that someone had written years ago who was in a small business, found themselves with 0 resources, found the original SANS Top 20 and said, I can do most of that if I just use the stuff that no one else is using. We already have this here, and here's some freeware here, and here's some open source here, and they kind of cobbled it together, and they wrote this paper. So I grabbed that paper, and that was one of the inspirations. In fact, I found the author, who's now the CISO for the Federal Reserve Bank of Atlanta, by the way. So he went from, you know,
small business,
working really literally on a shoestring in security to running a major enterprise there. And so he's a part of that team, right? And that's the kind of person that wound up on the team. So the idea was then, for folks that are trying to solve a problem, what can we do from CIS then to help them institutionalize it. Because again, it's not Joan's problem, it's everybody's problem. She just happens to be the inspiration to get going on it.
Well, and I think there's a general interest in helping small businesses because cybersecurity is the ultimate tragedy of the commons. The weakest link exposes everybody. It exposes the internet. So we need to have small businesses up their game.
I live in a rural county, and my doctor is a one-person practice. And about 2 years ago, he figured out what I do for a living. And I cannot leave his office without him turning to me and goes, and please just tell me what to buy. You know, and he can't figure out what to do about HIPAA, right? I mean, this is literally a one-man office with two people that work the desk and the billing and the records and the patients. And again, you know what? I want my doctor reading medical journals at night, not cyber journals, right? And we, collectively, right, want our experts in their fields to become better at that, not expect them to become better at this cybery stuff.
And it's a good analogy. The medical field's a good analogy because, like any pandemic starts with, the sick, the old, the young, that are not, prepared to be able to do it. And it's the same kind of thing. And there's some kind of tipping point of how many people that are vulnerable that could really, spread something. And what happened yesterday and 2 weeks ago is kind of an example of that. But to fix it was really easy.
I'm curious, just because New America is a nonprofit, how do you find, or have you given any thought to how these controls are put in place by a nonprofit versus a business, or is it just exactly the same?
No difference at all. When I go into an organization, the best indicator of how good they're doing IT risk management is the buy-in of the executives. If they understand their role in risk management, that IT as a function of risk management to the business, no matter what the business, no matter what the industry, no matter how big or small, then that is a measure of success. Because that's the hardest thing to get, is that governance process, as we kind of talked about. And so as long as the leadership of the organization understands that this is important, this is a business risk, I need a management just like any other the business risks that I track, then that's better. When you then pushing it down, it's like, oh, I have IT people, they're smart, they know what to do to protect me. Like, that's the wrong answer.
Nonprofits, well, they may not have profits at stake. They have a lot at stake.
Sure.
They depend upon trust of supporters. I remember years ago, one of the earliest data breaches when California was the only state that had a law, when I worked in another privacy office in state government, there was a breach at a couple of blood banks had a breach, and they had Social Security numbers. So imagine how you'd feel about giving blood if you get a letter from your blood bank saying, sorry, they lost your Social Security number. So it's really vital that nonprofits, and I think government is another example of having a special responsibility for cybersecurity and privacy, but right now let's say cybersecurity. Not only are there the same legal obligations that the private sector has when they have it, but it really depends on trust, and a lack of trust in government is a bad thing. People have to give their information to the government. You can't, I think I'll go to another DMV. I don't like the way you handle my information. You don't get to do that. You have to give it to IRS. You have to give it, which really doubles the obligation on the part of the government.
Yeah, right. Much of our social fabric runs on trust. And that's why I emphasize it's not good enough to just do a good job. You have to be able to explain to others, right, so they have confidence. And we've entered a world. I grew up in a world of what I call trust as a binary condition, right? You work for the government or you don't. You have a security clearance or you don't. You're one of our trusted contractors or you're not. Information is classified or it's not. Today, trust is really a dynamic condition that's negotiated constantly, right? So, and no one trusts anyone all the time, right? We trust each other for a purpose, for a particular span of time, typically, right? For a financial transaction, you're in my supply chain now, but maybe you're not next year. And so you absolutely have to have universal ways to talk about what's the problem we both face now in a business relationship. What are you doing about it? Here's what I'm doing about it. Let's negotiate if that's acceptable to both of us. And this is just part of life now. But right now it's kind of implicit, right? We don't think about it so much.
Yep, exactly.
Joan, what's been the feedback from organizations in California, companies and so forth? And I know it's only been a few months, but Curious if you've gotten
Well,
phone calls with people screaming on the other end of the line, or
Well, initially when the report came out, like other publications that we do, it got a lot of coverage in the law blogs, most of which were saying to their clients, well, you should do this, which is great. There was one that said, they've made a ceiling a floor. This is undoable, which, of course, we disagree with, and particularly since our recommendation, which was not a law, but a recommendation, was to apply the controls that are relevant to your environment. So we're not saying everybody do absolutely everything exactly as it is described. Reasonable and appropriate makes sense. With small businesses, there's been a very great interest in finding out more. We've done more than a dozen workshops in the past year with local chambers of commerce, with county medical societies, dental societies, county bar associations. Law firms are interesting challenges. Yeah. At which they're coming to recognize that they are the target of a lot of interest because they have a lot of really valuable information and may be less well protected than their clients. Yep. So, so there's been a real interest.
To keep it confidential.
Yeah.
Which I'm sure they're aware of as well. What advice do you have for other states around the country? Is this something that you would? Are you evangelizing like Tony is?
Well,
or
we're
do
not.
you think it's appropriate?
We're certainly. I think state attorneys general are very focused on cybersecurity because they all have data breach laws. And remember, a data breach opens up practices, and so you see what's going on that you wouldn't even have known about before. I mean, sometimes people have asked, how come there's so many data breaches? There didn't used to be. Well, maybe there were, and we just didn't know. So I think they're aware of that. We aren't proselytizing the controls. We're proselytizing do all you can to educate people on how they can best protect the data that's entrusted to them.
Yeah. Tony, do you have plans to?
He's the evangelist.
Right, as the evangelist on the panel.
It's a living.
Are you guys looking at other states? Obviously, California is a great example. It's
Right.
a huge state. It has a lot of tech. It has a lot of businesses. But there are other states out there that are, likely targets.
So we already have a number of states that are adopters of the controls and are kind of heading wherever we're going. They're part of that. CIS is also home of the multi-state ISAC, the Information Sharing Analysis Center. So that is our constituency, right, for a big part of CIS. So we host events, webcasts, define best practices, help people recover from bad things, all that sort of stuff. And then we have relationships with folks like the National Governors Association and other, I'll call them wholesale approaches out into state and local government. So there is a lot of interest in dealing with this problem, as Joan said, in state and locals. In the typical state and local government is woefully underfunded, undermanned for this kind of problem, right? They are not going to hire thousands of brand new cybersecurity practitioners. They're not going to bring in $1 million consulting gigs. They're really doing this very thinly. And many states, I think, I know, Jane, you know better than I, are not tightly managed at the central level. They would call it what I call horizontal. Lots of little agencies trying to do it on their own IT, their own privacy, their own security. So there's a lot of challenges in dealing with state and local. It's a very large, very diverse
Federal
audience.
government has that same problem.
Well, it does. I always say there's no federal government, right? There's a set of tribes that loosely operate together on a good day and fight with each other when budget time comes.
Yeah, yes. That's more or less right. And that's not even taking into account Congress. At this point, I think we've been talking for an hour here or so, and I'm sure we've got folks who probably have questions. So again, if you're watching the live stream and want to shoot questions at us, you can use the NewAM Cyber account if you want to throw an @ in front of that, and also the hashtag is NewAMCIS if you want to ping questions at our panel. And with that, I'll yeah, ma'am.
Ms. McNabb, you mentioned there was in 2018 a European law going to be enacted about. Could you just tell us what
briefly.
She's not your lawyer, though.
Yeah, briefly. The General Data Protection Regulation, GDPR, the European Union has had a comprehensive privacy legal scheme since the early 90s. But the existing one is called the directive, the Data Protection Directive, and that means it's up to the individual member nations to pass their own national laws that are consistent with the directive. The new regulation is going to apply as law to all the different EU nations, and so that's one thing that's different about, but also it includes some newer provisions, because imagine laws passed in the 90s, how they're missing certain things. So among the features of the new GDPR, the regulation, are this requirement to do data inventories and risk assessments, and what are some of the others?
Well, the important thing is that it applies to any multinational company organization that has employees, customers, or any offices in European Union. And so some of these small, which including anyone who has a website that has customers in the EU, will have to be able to abide by this. So that becomes very broad and very impactful to folks in the US. Why? Because before there was this, European privacy laws have always been more strict than the US, and that's a whole other panel on that. But the basics is that, because they did not feel that anything in the US was safe enough to hold EU privacy data, there was at one time the safe harbor that a company could individually say, hey, I'm holding it to the same standards. And then that went away because they didn't think it was good enough, and then Privacy Shield for about a few months, and then now this GDPR that's coming out is going to be a longer term. So we talk a little bit about it in the control. We don't want to get into it because, again, that's a whole other paper. But it's going to impact a lot of people in the world.
And we may get some benefits out of it. In that, just as a big state like California can have an impact on other states, so that even before they had data breach notification laws, after one big breach in 2005 in which the company did not notify in other states, even though people were affected, they now do, and they started notifying big multi-state breaches, started resulting in notification in states even before they had breach laws.
Right, just for everybody, because it's easier than piecing out who
it's
needs
operationally easier as well as safer.
Yeah. Then we'll go there.
Hi, Maurice Turner, Congressional Innovation Fellow. Going along with what you were talking about with California having broad-reaching impacts, when it comes to regulation, doesn't it, by sort of a de facto manner, make California's regulations a federal regulation? And going along with that, what efforts have been made by California to coordinate their regulations with other states and also with federal regulation makers?
It's sort of like the highest common denominator might tend to prevail across multiple jurisdictions. That can happen as in the case of auto emission standards, for example. But we actually do look, when we're developing, not the Attorney General's office looks when we are developing best practice recommendations. We look globally to try and harmonize what we recommend. So we're not talking about regulations here, with global requirements. So aiming to make it more implementable. In the case of laws, California, the legislature often does consider other states and other laws. In the same breach report in which we pointed to the CIS Critical Security Controls, we also encouraged harmonizing of state data breach notification laws as a better alternative than preemption by a federal law, all of the versions of which existed up to that point would have lowered the standard, harmonizing at the lowest common denominator. So our recommendation is that states look at sort of trimming some of the peaks and valleys in some respects to address the issue of compliance complication, recognizing that the states have been able to make to respond like laboratories of democracy and come up with things that might take longer to happen at the federal level absent state innovation.
My name is Dalton Booker. I'm a program associate with the Osgood Institute for International Studies, and my question is, we're talking a lot about, breaches of security and breaches of privacy from external actors, but I wonder if any of you guys could speak to breaches of security and privacy by governmental actors. A most recent example, or a recent example, being the matter with the San Bernardino shooter's iPhone, stuff like that.
Risk is irrelevant of intent, and when you're managing it, and it also is irrelevant of the actor. Where understanding the actor and their intent helps in better defense, but it's not like, I have these controls to go after state actors, I have these controls for insider threat, because insider, we talk a lot about insider threat as being, I say 4 different quadrants. It's the most likely it's unintentional and non-malicious. All the way to,
Oops, I sent this email to the wrong
exactly.
person.
That's the most common thing, and that's, again, risk is irrelevant of intent, to malicious but non-intentional, intentional, non-malicious, to malicious and intentional. Those 4 different quadrants. And you need to kind of address all of those from an inside perspective and an outside perspective as well. So there's nothing unique, I guess I'll say, there's nothing unique about what you would do in a good IT risk management practice, regardless of what you're worried about.
It's probably outside the threat model for most average companies as well. I mean,
Right.
unless you're Apple and you're making an iPhone, you're probably not too
Or
worried
defense
about it.
industrial base, but that's also, part of the thing is having a risk register and a risk, risk model of like, these are the things I worry about and these are the things I worry about them doing, doing it against me, and that may include that.
Yeah, it's a matter of sort of like tradecraft, right?
Right.
Again, the controls are aimed at the mass market. We should all worry about this, even if we don't know we should. We should just do it. But also, we look at the controls also with an eye and with partners like the US CERT and other people who are dealing with incidents, right? So the idea of controls is both prevention, but also narrowing the attack surface, and also helping to manage, I'll call it accountability, right? One of the people I learned from in the business many years ago said, when you can't build in security, then build in accountability. So that means administrative privilege and rights, and so when something happens, you can figure out, it's not always about the human, right? It's someone posed as that human, someone took over an account, but if you can't sort of bound the problem, you can never figure out exactly what happened. So some of the controls are really there to help you with that problem too, to say, if I need to dig back deeper, can I narrow down how this attack entered my enterprise, who allowed it to go to the next step, what process did they take over, so that you can do that kind of analysis.
And then what can we do about those things?
Right, and then again, that might take, but again, for the kind of things that we do, I say people wish they had more threat information. Right. Here's my opinion. The overwhelming vast majority of things you need to do to defend yourself in cyberspace are already in the public. Right? The information that you need, if you could take action on what you already have without any spooky, fancy information, you would be so far above the norm. You'd be essentially invincible against most adversaries.
Install the Microsoft patches, for crying out loud.
Yeah, exactly.
Ian.
Hi, Ian Wallace from here at New America. Thank you for this fantastic panel. I think what California is doing presents a really interesting natural experiment. So my question is, to what extent are you using that opportunity by working with researchers, comparing what's going on in California to what happened before, what might be happening in other jurisdictions where the controls are being used, and how can we make sure that we learn the lessons from this, not just sort of anecdotally, but with real data?
I don't know. It's a hard thing to track, even just to get a handle on who's actually implementing the controls. So it would be exceedingly useful, and I just don't, it's not something that we've got within our reach.
Yeah, one thing we do now that we could not do just a couple years ago is track better who downloads them, who's adopting, what are they doing. One of our philosophies is most of us learn best by learning from someone else who's done it already. So again, part of the role of the nonprofit is to find people that have solved things, help extract the lesson, write it down, document it, and then share it much more broadly. So we have a bunch of those things going on. I would say, with some experience, here's just an idea on the fly. Maybe I can talk Joan into proposing an RSA talk with me for 2018, because I think looking at the sort of technical controls side and privacy side together might be a good discussion that we could set up, or even this kind of panel is frankly above the level, the average, the talk that I see in many of these major conferences. We also are working with a number of other folks from CIS to look at these called data-driven studies. I mean, we are not to where we would like to be in this business, right? Where we actually make decisions based upon data. Mm-hmm. This is pretty much still a folklore, wizardry, model, and that's reflected in the things that we do. I gave the example of why did we pick this set of controls? 5 friends, right? I looked around at 5 friends. They're smarter than me. We came up with something. That's a trust me model. That 5 friends became 5,000 friends, right? Still basic model, just more of them. What we've done over the last few years is we've approached, I think, almost all the leading threat intelligence companies who basically, I've been looking for everyone who collects lots of data based upon their business model, summarizes it at the end of some time period, and gives that away for free. All right, so the Verizon data breach folks, HP Symantec, Palo Alto, all those kind of folks, working with them to talk to the authors, map the summary of what they are seeing into the controls, right? So what I'm doing is trying to build a more rigorous data-driven. There are a lot of people working on the big data, advanced analytics end of this. More power to them. I hope they succeed, but I can't wait. So now we're working with, I'll call it the authoritative sources of what's going wrong out there. And now we're talking to a number of academic folks and potential partners around sort of specific studies around how do I establish a real solid empirical basis to good practice, right? Again, we need these things socially, right, across the board. But this is the way we've been approaching it, from the kind of trust me, moving towards a more data-driven approach. We'd love to be able to help Joan. I think we're a ways off, though, from sort of this before and after kind of data gathering, because the machinery is just not in place that you would have in the CDC, for the spread of diseases or whatever. But I think a lot of us are working towards it.
I mean, just the difficulty of really knowing what's going on is, I look year by year, it looks like we've had an increasing share of breaches reported to us by small businesses. So is that because they are more often having breaches, or is it because they are learning that they are required to report breaches, or because they are learning that they had a breach?
Right.
Yep. All those things.
Yeah.
Yeah, do Emma and then come here.
Hi, Emma Falgao from the Cybersecurity Initiative here, but I have an eye on Twitter, and there's a question that's come in online. 2-part question for Tony. One is if you could discuss version v 7.0 and treatment of middle boxes, and if you'll answer that, maybe explain what that is. Treatment of middle boxes and v 7.0. If you could want to answer that briefly, but then also if you could discuss the adoption of controls globally.
All right, I'm not sure I can answer the first question, but I can guarantee I know who asked the question. So middle boxes is a term for, we are where we are in the state of the internet, right? And what you see, I'll read this sort of cartoonishly, governments trying to figure out their role in something that they didn't control or design. And so you have this issue of monitoring. How do I monitor for bad things? At the same time, there's this mad rush to encrypt everything, right? To tunnel everything, the web accesses, transactions, and there's security merit to that also. But that also blocks things in the middle from monitoring for bad packets, malware, and so forth, right? So there's kind of a natural tension around these issues of where do I monitor for best effect, and where do I, in effect, protect in a tunnel or a sleeve, in a cryptographic sense, information. And no one has a simple answer to that. The marketplace has responded. I mean, there are products that you can buy today that act as a middle box, right? That is, the end user in your enterprise thinks they are talking to, a merchant or whoever online. They're really being interrupted by a middle box, which is managing the security, monitoring, right, and sort of establishing this invisible. I used to call it a man-in-the-middle attack machine, But they sit in the middle for security purpose, right, to monitor transactions that otherwise would be unprotected and unmonitored at the boundary of a device, or of an enterprise. So anyway, so there's a lot of discussion about how that is best managed. I think that is a part of the environment, and this is on our list of topics to talk about for the next version. So we're struggling right now, not struggling, we're gathering the kinds of topics and these sort of tough questions about how or should we address them in version 7. We haven't committed to a date for that yet, but there's nothing static about this environment, right? So technology is rapidly changing, the role of governments is changing, the role that they play is changing, and every nation has a different way of thinking about either how they manage security or what their role is or what they want their citizens to see or not see. So this is the kind of topic that really is meant by this middle box idea. I'm sorry, the second question.
Was about the adoption of the controls globally.
Globally. Yes. One of the great surprises of this, and although we are homed in the U.S., the adoption base is actually very significant outside the U.S. I think a third of our downloads, something like that, are non-U.S. And we have a couple of our great friends and adopters and crazed volunteers up here on the stage. We have a countless number of them outside the U.S. So we have volunteer translations of the controls into multiple languages. We have people who are on their own carry the story of the controls to European standards bodies, to nations across Asia, to all kinds of different forums. So it's something that, again, happened organically. For this year and beyond, now we're sort of thinking maybe we should get more involved in these things and figure out where we want them to go, right? And support the people that have taken on their own the initiative to create these. So it is incredibly exciting, though, the level of interest, I'll say, in the UK, Canada, Germany, Europe at large, India, Japan, Lithuania, all kinds of adoption outside of that. So it really helps us see, number one, the hunger for something. I think there is a general social concern, you might say distrust of central governments. And people are looking for independent nonprofit voices, I think, in cybersecurity. So I think we help fill that niche. So I think we're not even at the beginnings of the story on outside the U.S. adoption of the controls.
And we've evolved over the years of being less U.S.-centric
Right.
and kind of referencing other international standards and kind of considering things like GDPR coming up and things like that to kind of accommodate that.
Cyril Draffin, MIT. Could you talk about any benchmarks you currently have or thinking of having in privacy or in data protection and integrity, which is one of your top 20?
Well, benchmarks are tough. I may defer to Tony on what the CIS does generally otherwise, because it's all about the acceptable level of risk of an organization. Some of that may be dictated by a regulation, which again we understand is the floor, but I have dealt with organizations that in the same industry of the same size that are more open than others, the culture, what they accept and what they don't accept, because as cybersecurity risk management practitioners, we don't make the final decisions, the executives do. They're responsible for the keeping the business in business, keeping the organization up and running, and anything that could impact that, which may happen to be a technical risk, maybe a legal risk, it could be a physical risk. And so, my coming around to the answer is, it might be different for every organization, and it's from my perspective, because I deal with commercial clients, it is a business risk of like, well, what is the benchmark of, at this point it's okay, and at this point it's bad, and we got to react to it, and that might be different for everybody. Unfortunately, it's not a firm answer, but that's my perspective.
And just to complement Rick's point, I mean, the whole the issue of data protection, right? Within the controls document itself, our goal is to make sure that you have thought through the issues of data protection, right? What of the type and where it is and how it's stored, and that the technical controls to manage it are in place. And then these issues of how it specifically applies to a business, we would address in a complementary way, like we have done with privacy. Have you thought through these things? Here are the implications of the technical controls. You'll see, I think, a different approach to cryptography in general within version 7 of the controls, for example. Right now, there's pieces of it everywhere, but it really is we need a foundationally different way to look at it so that the mechanism is in place to manage all these kinds of business decisions, right? At the end of the day, the goal is have confidence in our business decisions that translate into a policy and that the policy is enforced through technology.
And that, I don't know if that's where you're going with like quantum computing and quantum proofing encryption, which is kind of like, okay, for some organizations that might be a thing based on who the threat actors against them might be, or it may not.
And while this isn't exactly the same use of the benchmarking as is used in security, I think in privacy there's a rethinking of benchmarking. The US privacy legal scheme has basically come to be notice and choice. It's a marketplace model. Tell people what you're doing with their data and they can choose. There's a general dissatisfaction with that among a lot of people in that the notice is often unnoticeable and the choice is take it or leave it. So what is a better approach? The European approach comes out of human rights rather than a sort of marketplace approach. And our marketplace approach and lack of a comprehensive law may have been instrumental in the development of Silicon Valley. I read a paper on that, how law made Silicon Valley, that the light hand touch. But with big data, with the persistent surveillance of the internet of everything, the need to, from a societal perspective, not just an individual rights perspective, the need to have a concept of privacy and a legal scheme that can defend it appropriately, I think has gotten greater, and there's a lot of thinking going on in that regard.
And one final quick thing is, I spent a lot of time in Canada, and one of the things that someone from RCMP had kind of brought up is, let's not confuse privacy and anonymity. Because, are we trying to get to a point of being anonymous online, or are we getting to a point of like private, which is more, which has a little more, nuances to it. And I think that a lot of times, because of the fear of the government, it's like, well, I want to be anonymous. So it's like, and so you confuse that with being, well, I need to protect my privacy. We still have license plates on our cars that, that's a good example of privacy, but not anonymity. 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 Yeah.
Aluminum.
I think we have time for one more question, and Mr. Morgus.
Rob Morgus from here as well, work with Ross and Ian. So there's been a lot of talk about the positive aspects of the controls. I'm curious if there is anything, and it might be that I don't fully understand the way in which the controls sort of came about, but I'm gathering that there basically was a group that generated some sort of consensus on what should be in there. Was there anything that any of you would have liked to see in there that didn't make it in there, or sort of any of the self-critical shortcomings of the controls themselves?
Every year we argue about that. And that's one of the things, I've been on many different large-scale panels and things like that. And what I appreciate about this is the buck stops with Tony. Like we all, because I've noticed in large, organizations, volunteered not unlike this, that we never get anything done because everyone is fighting for their thing, and then we just kind of push the decision down, and a year later we're still arguing about the same things. But that's what's kind of great about this is, like Tony said, he has his list of 150 things, and if someone pops up like, oh, that's going to go up higher on the list, but everyone has their things, that they're pet things, and Tony's like, nope, this is what we're going to do. It's like, okay.
Yeah, I never claim to run, in IT, you hear consensus process. It's not really a consensus. The discipline here is in keeping the list short, not in making the list long. So security wonks, right? We could sit down together. We come up with this 1,000 this afternoon without even blinking. That's great, but it's not helpful in the sense of what we're trying to do. So the discipline is about, okay, we've talked about this enough. Discussion's over. We're making a choice. And that's the thing that, if you go to a formal standards body, right, they're often consensus driven. Everyone brings their pet rock, their favorite idea. They take years to evolve. And they play a vital role, right? I mean, that's why we have the internet we have today. But they don't move at the kind of speed that we're trying to do with the controls. So the goal is, discipline, priority, right? Shorter is better. Be much more focused. We are not trying to replace the FISMA catalog, ISO, COBIT. Those have their own place. we are very much about, what bad things are happening and what should everyone be doing to stop it. So I would say my definition of consensus, everyone walks away from the table, myself included, that some favorite thing of theirs is not in the list, okay? And that's okay. We're actually better served. Ever see a quote so good you wish you had said it? We all have. Here's the one that was said by a guy named Hal Pomerantz, who is a consultant and an instructor for SANS. He once wrote this in his blog, and I have his permission to use it. The problem with the information security business is that experts agree on 90% of what needs to get done. Sounds pretty good. However, they spend 90% of their time arguing to the death about the last 10%. It's like, that's the world I grew up in, right? Exactly. And we argue, angels on the head of a pin about the nuanced, helicopter, drop the robot spider down the chimney. Right, yep. I've been in that discussion 1,000 times, and people say it with a straight face. But for most of us, we should not worry about that.
And so one last quote, another quote from one of my tech heroes, Melvin Kranzberg, whose fourth law of technology is that in technology policy debates, the policy perspective must prevail. So one of the policies that significantly informs the CIS Critical Security Controls is the idea of priority, of getting the most bang for your buck. So that's one of the things that I think is really valuable about them.
But having said that, we have a long list of things we've been collecting, and we welcome input on topics that we must think about for version 7, right? And some of them will be in, some of them will change the way version 7 addresses them versus prior things. So we have been collecting feedback. And this is essentially a crowdsourced idea, right? Mm-hmm. This is about who's the best out there, who's got a better idea, bring it to the table, we will figure out a way to deal with it. And so there's no mystery think tank behind me other than great people like Rick and Joan, volunteers who contribute to this sort of thing.
It's a great note to end on, I think. Tony, Joan, Rick, thank you all so much for joining us here today. Can we get a round of applause for these folks? Remember, Friday, 10 o'clock, right back here, public-private partnerships aside from information sharing. We'll have another great panel for you on then. Thanks very much. Thank you.